Tonight, we uncover a secret strategy that shook France and the West to their core, the hidden gold convoys that moved under the cover of night, the IMF threats that nearly strangled a nation, and the mysterious plan of one man, Ibrahim Traoré, whose vision turned whispers of rebellion into a storm no empire could silence. Before we begin this journey, make sure to like this video, share it with those who need to hear the truth, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story the world doesn't want you to know. The world's most powerful capitals were awake that night, though Burkina Faso lay in darkness. In Paris, Washington, and Brussels, unease pulsed like a fever. Something was stirring in the dry heart of Africa, something they had not predicted, something they could not control. For decades, gold had flowed silently out of Burkina Faso, as if siphoned through invisible veins. It slipped from the calloused hands of miners into the vaults of corporations, into the reserves of foreign banks, into the crowns of nations that did not bleed under its sun. Officially, the country remained poor, clinging to survival. Unofficially, it was a land that glimmered with untold wealth, a paradox so deep that it felt cursed. And now, there was a new name whispered in the corridors of Western power: Ibrahim Traoré. A soldier, a son of the soil, and a man whose silence unsettled even the most seasoned diplomats. Unlike others before him, he was not begging for aid or negotiating for crumbs. He was planning, waiting, watching. Reports began trickling in, satellite images of convoys moving at night, coded transmissions between remote mining sites, unusual traffic at airstrips. To Western analysts, it was unmistakable. Traoré was orchestrating something with Burkina Faso's gold, but no one could see the full picture. The strategy was veiled, its purpose hidden in layers of secrecy. In Paris, intelligence officers argued furiously. Was he selling to the East? Had he discovered hidden reserves? Or was this the beginning of a financial rebellion that could unravel France's hold on its former colony? The uncertainty was more dangerous than the truth. Burkina Faso itself was restless. Farmers whispered that Traoré had vowed to break the chains of colonial theft. Miners told stories of him visiting pits in person, standing ankle-deep in the dust where boys half their age swung pickaxes. Rumors spread of ancient vaults, of gold buried during the days of Thomas Sankara, treasure hidden so that one day it might return to the people. The West scoffed at such tales. Yet beneath their arrogance, fear grew. Fear that for the first time in modern history, an African leader had more than courage. He had a plan. The desert wind carried whispers that even the poorest villagers could feel. Something was coming. The silence before the storm. The kind of silence that unnerved empires. And as the French president held an emergency midnight call with his ministers, as IMF officials drafted new threats of sanctions, as mercenaries sharpened their knives in shadowed barracks, one truth began to echo through every frightened office in the West. Ibrahim Traoré was about to play his hand, and what he did next would not only shake France, it would rattle the very foundations of the West itself. Burkina Faso was a nation carved by contradictions, endless fields of dust, yet soil rich in minerals, rivers that promised life, yet villages that drank from cracked wells, children who worked the mines while men in foreign suits counted profits oceans away. Ibrahim Traoré had grown up in the shadows of these contradictions. As a boy, he had seen the trucks rumble past his village, heavy with ore destined for ports he would never see. He had seen his mother boiling wild leaves to make a bitter soup because rice was too expensive, though gold lay beneath their feet. He had felt the silence of fathers too tired to speak after 12-hour days in the shafts. The injustice was not just an idea to him, it was the fabric of his youth. When he rose to power, the people whispered Sankara's name once more. Thomas Sankara, the man who had defied France, who had spoken of self-sufficiency and dignity, who had been killed before his vision could bloom. Traoré was seen as his echo, but he was no mere shadow. He was something new, quiet, calculating, unyielding. Where Sankara had inspired with words, Traoré unnerved with silence, but the silence could not hide the hunger. By the time Traoré took the helm, Burkina Faso was suffocating. The IMF demanded payments for debts that had long since multiplied beyond reason. Structural adjustments had dismantled schools and hospitals. Fertile lands were mortgaged to foreign corporations. Villages starved, even as convoys of gold left the mines each month. The people's patience was waning. Mothers buried children who had wasted away, their ribs pressing against skin like the wooden frames of broken drums. Soldiers muttered about unpaid salaries. Farmers cursed the soil as their hands blistered without harvest. Each day, despair grew heavier, and in the midst of this despair, 3 men watched Traore closely. They were not generals of honor, but opportunists, shadows in uniform, nurtured under French influence. Each owed his fortune to foreign patrons. Each had been promised a reward if Traore fell. To them, loyalty was an illusion. Power was the only currency. Together they plotted in secret, their alliance stitched by greed and betrayal. Traore knew of them. He had eyes in the barracks, ears in the markets, whispers that reached him even in the dead of night. He did not confront them, not yet. His mind was fixed on something greater. Because while his enemies schemed in back rooms, Traore searched for gold. Not the gold already mapped and stolen under contracts signed decades ago. He sought the forgotten seams, the unregistered veins, the vaults hidden away when Sankara still dreamed of independence. Stories had lingered, of Sankara's men burying reserves before his assassination, of maps burned but not forgotten, of chambers sealed deep beneath the Sahel sands. To most, these were legends. To Traore, they were possibilities. He began quietly assembling a circle of geologists, historians, and loyal miners. Under the cover of humanitarian projects, they moved through villages, testing soil, studying forgotten colonial records. Each discovery was concealed beneath layers of secrecy, reported only to Traore himself. Meanwhile, the IMF tightened its noose. Their envoys arrived in Ouagadougou with smiles sharpened like blades, demanding more reforms, warning of frozen loans. Behind them lurked the French attachés, speaking the language of partnership, but moving with the arrogance of ownership. Burkina Faso must honor its agreements, they said. Agreements signed by governments that no longer existed, enforced by debts that could never be repaid. Traore listened. He nodded. He shook their hands. But within he raged. The betrayal was not only external. Some of his ministers, still tied by invisible strings to foreign capitals, counseled him to surrender. "We cannot fight the West," they whispered. "We must bend." To them, survival meant obedience. But Traore was not thinking of survival. He was thinking of strategy. And so, in the desert nights, convoys moved silently, carrying equipment not listed in any budget. In the forests, miners worked without permits, their tools glowing faintly under the moon. Soldiers swore secrecy upon pain of exile. Slowly, piece by piece, a hidden puzzle took shape. Rumors spread among the people, whispers of Traore's plan. Mothers told children that soon they would eat. Farmers believed that the soil might once again yield. Miners dreamed that the gold would finally belong to them. Hope crept quietly into the cracks where despair had long dwelled. But hope was dangerous. France's intelligence services intercepted fragments of messages, traced the movements of men too loyal to the young captain. They saw the pattern, even if they could not decode it fully. A storm was forming, one that could not be ignored. And so, while Traore laid his plans, so too did the West. Sanctions were drafted. Covert agents were dispatched. Newspapers began to paint him as reckless, unstable, a threat to his own people. Propaganda spilled into the airwaves, sowing doubt among soldiers and civilians alike. The 3 generals, sensing opportunity, tightened their pact. They would strike when the time was right, when France gave the signal. But time was the one thing Traore controlled. He moved like a shadow across his own nation, knowing that the walls were closing in, yet unwilling to reveal his hand. His silence was not ignorance. It was calculation. And as the desert winds howled and famine deepened, as children slept hungry and elites sharpened their knives, Ibrahim Traoré prepared to unveil a strategy so audacious, so dangerous, that it could rewrite the fate of Burkina Faso forever. The storm did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised as policy, sanctions, whispers, and hunger. The West had learned that empires did not always need guns. Sometimes, starvation was more effective. The IMF struck first. Loans were frozen, currency reserves withheld. Shipments of grain, already scarce, stalled at foreign ports. Medicines that once trickled into Burkina Faso vanished overnight. The official justification was economic instability, but the truth was clear. The world was punishing Ibrahim Traoré for his defiance. In the markets of Ouagadougou, mothers wept as prices tripled in a single week. Bags of rice became treasures. A handful of medicine cost more than a month's wages.
Children with hollow eyes lined the streets, begging for scraps from men who had none to give. The famine grew teeth, and in this silence of despair, France's shadow armies moved.
Mercenaries slipped across borders, dressed as traders, their rifles hidden in crates of cloth and salt. Ministers loyal to Paris received coded messages, instructing them to destabilize from within. The three generals, long waiting for their moment, began recruiting soldiers with promises of power, whispering that Traoré was reckless, that he would lead the nation into ruin. But Traoré did not bend. Each night he sat in a dimly lit room with maps spread before him, gold veins marked in red, convoy routes marked in black. His closest aides could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the fire that refused to die. He knew the suffering of his people. He knew the betrayal gathering at his doorstep. And still he moved in silence, because his strategy was not yet complete. Deep in the desert, work continued. A convoy of battered trucks carried drilling machines across sands that swallowed men whole. Soldiers loyal only to Traoré guarded them, rifles gleaming under the moonlight. The miners whispered of hidden vaults buried decades ago, chambers sealed with concrete, maps etched in code. Each strike of the pickaxe echoed like a heartbeat, each discovery buried again under layers of secrecy. Traoré understood that time was his greatest enemy. The people's suffering was a fire that burned too quickly. He had to act, yet every move revealed too much to the eyes watching from Paris. And still, betrayal pressed closer. One of the generals, impatient, ordered his men to intercept a convoy rumored to be carrying gold. They ambushed it at dusk, only to find barrels of water and sacks of grain. The soldiers returned empty-handed, humiliated, while whispers spread in the barracks. Traoré was playing a deeper game than anyone understood. The West, frustrated, turned harsher. Propaganda filled the airwaves. Western media painted him as a dictator clinging to power, a reckless soldier leading his nation to collapse. Editorials spoke of responsibility to intervene. Behind those words, mercenary columns gathered in the Sahel, preparing for the day the order would come, and the famine sharpened. Villages emptied as families walked miles in search of food. Children collapsed by the roadside. Farmers dug trenches not for planting but for graves. The country itself seemed to teeter on the edge of death. Soldiers began to doubt. Some asked why their families starved while their leader spoke only in riddles. The three generals fanned those doubts, promising rations and stability if only Traoré were gone. In the silence of the barracks, betrayal fermented like rot, and yet amid the despair, strange signs began to appear. In remote villages, food shipments arrived at night, no one knew from where. Farmers claimed men in uniform delivered rice and grain but refused to give their names. In the markets, gold dust appeared in small quantities, exchanged for food, bypassing the central banks. Some swore Traoré himself had visited the mines, standing in the dust, promising the gold would one day be theirs. The West could not see it clearly, but a pattern was forming. Traoré was moving gold quietly, carefully, building reserves outside the eyes of France and the IMF. Each ounce extracted was hidden, each shipment coded in secrecy. It was not theft, it was reclamation, but with every step forward, danger grew sharper. France accelerated its plans. Special forces landed quietly in neighboring countries, waiting for the signal. Agents in Ouagadougou funneled cash to the generals, urging them to strike. Intelligence reports warned that within weeks, a coup would be attempted. The tension was unbearable. Traoré walked a knife's edge, each day knowing that betrayal might come at dawn. And still he pressed forward. His silence was not weakness. It was the stillness before a decisive move. He was holding the weight of a nation, the hunger of millions. The legacy of Sankara, all balanced in a fragile strategy no one yet understood. And so, as famine deepened and betrayal sharpened, as France prepared to strike and the generals whispered treachery, Ibrahim Traoré prepared to step into the storm. For hidden beneath the dust, locked within maps older than the betrayals themselves, lay the key to his plan, a gold strategy so daring, so audacious, that it would either break Burkina Faso completely or shake France and the entire West to their very core. The night was moonless when the convoy began its journey. 20 trucks moved like ghosts across the desert, their headlights blacked out, their engines muffled under cloth. Soldiers crouched in the dust, rifles slung across their chests, eyes sharp with exhaustion and fear. They did not know the full purpose of the mission. Only one man did, Ibrahim Traoré. He sat in the lead truck, his red beret casting a shadow across his eyes. His silence weighed heavier than the rifles around him. For months he had played a dangerous game, outmaneuvering France, deceiving his own generals, feeding his people scraps of hope, while hiding a strategy that even his closest allies could not grasp. Tonight that silence would end. Far away in Paris, intelligence officers stared at satellite screens. They had tracked the convoy, piecing together fragments of intercepted transmissions. The alarm spread quickly. Mercenary columns were mobilized. Planes lifted from nearby airstrips. The French president received a midnight briefing. Traoré is moving something. We cannot let him succeed. But by the time the order was given, it was already too late. The convoy reached a barren plateau where the sand shifted like waves under the wind. Here, decades ago, Thomas Sankara's men had hidden what they could not protect. Reserves smuggled away before his assassination. Gold buried in chambers no colonial hand had ever rediscovered. The map had been passed in whispers, guarded by silence, preserved like a secret prayer through generations. Traoré stepped from the truck. Around him his soldiers watched, uncertain. He raised a hand, and miners emerged from the shadows, carrying tools that glinted under the starlight. They worked in silence, guided by coordinates etched into scraps of paper, older than the soldiers themselves. Hours passed. Then, with a groan of stone and dust, the earth opened. A vault, hidden beneath the desert floor, sealed away from history, untouched by foreign hands. The men gasped. Inside lay bars of gold stacked like forgotten pillars of light, coins from decades past, dust-coated yet dazzling even in the dim glow of lanterns. For a moment the soldiers stared as if seeing a miracle, but miracles invite enemies. The first attack came before dawn. Mercenaries, guided by betrayers within, descended upon the plateau. Gunfire cracked across the desert. The convoy shuddered under the storm of bullets. Soldiers fell. Dust rose like smoke from a battlefield. The three generals watching from afar believed the trap had succeeded, but Traoré had anticipated betrayal. The ambush was met with precision. His loyalists formed a ring around the vault, their rifles answering every shadow. The miners, carrying bars of gold, were shielded by soldiers willing to bleed for a dream larger than themselves. The desert erupted in fire, but within that fire the strategy revealed itself, because Traoré was not simply protecting the gold. He was moving it. Hidden beneath tarps in the trucks were not only rifles, but encrypted satellite equipment. As his men fought, engineers connected transmissions to allies beyond Africa, nations that had long awaited a chance to bypass the Western stranglehold. Signals pulsed through the night, carrying a single announcement that shattered the silence of centuries. Burkina Faso would no longer sell its gold to France or the West. Instead, it would trade directly with African neighbors and Eastern partners, in local currencies and in new alliances beyond Western reach. The strategy was not about gold alone. It was about breaking the spine of dependence. By controlling their own resource, Burkina Faso would set a precedent no empire could ignore. The mercenaries fought harder, realizing too late that the plan was already in motion. Convoys carrying reserves began dispersing in multiple directions, vanishing into the desert, shielded by men who fought as if their very lives were bound to the gold they carried. Betrayal within the ranks was silenced in the dust. Those who turned their rifles against Traoré were met with the cold steel of soldiers who refused to bow. The battle stretched into hours. Smoke curled into the dawn sky. By sunrise, the plateau was littered with silence, mercenaries retreating, their mission broken, their masters humiliated. The generals who had plotted betrayal realized their scheme had failed. Traore still stood, but it was not victory by gunfire alone. It was victory by revelation. Across the airwaves, his announcement echoed. The gold of Burkina Faso belongs not to Paris, not to Washington, but to the people of Africa. From this day forward, we will no longer bleed to enrich others. We will rise. The words struck like thunder. In markets across West Africa, traders stopped in disbelief. In homes where radios crackled, mothers wept with a hope they had never dared to feel. In capitals across the West, panic spread. Stock markets trembled. Analysts scrambled to understand how a small, landlocked nation had dared to defy centuries of order. And in Paris, the president stared at his advisors with fury and fear. The plan had failed. The gold was gone. The strategy had unfolded in silence and struck like lightning. Traore stood at the edge of the vault as the sun rose, its rays painting the horizon in crimson fire. His uniform was dust-stained, his beret tilted low. Around him his men stood battered but unbroken. They looked not at a soldier, but at a leader who had dared the impossible. And as the desert wind carried the scent of battle away, one truth became undeniable. Traore had shaken not just France, but the very foundations of the West. The desert dawn had witnessed defiance. But the true battle began in the days that followed. France reeled. For decades it had relied on Burkina Faso's silence, on its obedience, on the quiet extraction of wealth from the veins of its soil. Now that silence was broken, now the world had heard Ibrahim Traoré's voice, and it could not be unheard. In Paris, officials met behind closed doors, their faces drawn with disbelief. The intelligence reports were clear. Traoré had secured hidden reserves, bypassed Western banking systems, and announced a gold trade policy that severed France's grip. Markets trembled. The CFA franc, long a symbol of France's control in West Africa, wavered under scrutiny. Investors whispered of instability, of a colonial order finally cracking. The IMF sent urgent envoys. They demanded explanations, they threatened sanctions, they warned of isolation. But isolation no longer frightened Burkina Faso, for Traoré had not acted alone. Within hours of his announcement, envoys from neighboring nations reached out, offering trade, food, and alliance. Across Africa, leaders who had long bowed to pressure began to wonder. If Traoré could resist, why couldn't they? The ripples spread like fire on dry grass. In Mali, Niger, Guinea, whispers turned to declarations. Perhaps it was time to reconsider their own contracts, their own debts, their own chains. In markets from Lagos to Addis Ababa, ordinary people spoke his name with reverence. He was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a symbol. But symbols are dangerous. The West redoubled its propaganda. Newspapers painted him as a reckless populist, a dictator hiding behind slogans. Analysts warned of collapse. Aid organizations predicted famine. Mercenaries, though defeated, still prowled the Sahel, waiting for another chance. The 3 generals who had betrayed him were captured, but their networks remained, festering in the shadows. Traoré knew this. He knew the victory was fragile, but he also knew the people had tasted something far more powerful than gold: dignity. In the villages, food began to return. Grain shipments, purchased not with loans but with gold reserves, reached starving families. Farmers who had abandoned their fields returned, seeds in their hands, and hope in their chests. Children who had gone to sleep with empty stomachs awoke to bowls of rice and sorghum. For the first time in years, laughter echoed in homes where silence had once reigned. The miners, long exploited, became guardians of the new order. They carried the memory of the vault, the proof that their labor had never been in vain. Each grain of gold dust now represented not theft but liberation, and yet Traoré never celebrated. His silence remained. He stood before his nation not as a man drunk with victory, but as a sentinel, aware that empires do not fall in a single night, aware that retaliation would come, aware that the road ahead was long and fraught with peril. Still, the world was changing. Across the continent, voices rose. Leaders who had once echoed Western lines began to question them. Activists marched through capitals with signs declaring Africa for Africans. Intellectuals wrote of a new dawn. Even in the diaspora, far from Ouagadougou, Africans spoke of Traore as proof that resistance was not only possible, but necessary. In Europe, fear grew. Banks calculated the cost of lost reserves. Corporations whispered of contracts slipping through their fingers. Politicians fretted over the crumbling illusion of control. For the first time in decades, the question was not whether Africa needed Europe, but whether Europe could survive without Africa. And in the heart of Burkina Faso, under a sky still heavy with dust, Ibrahim Traoré walked through a village where famine had once ruled. Children ran barefoot beside him, their laughter rising like music. Mothers placed their hands on his shoulders, blessing him not with words but with tears. Farmers bowed their heads, offering him not gold but the first baskets of harvested grain. He said little. He never did. But his silence carried weight heavier than speeches. The people understood he was not promising paradise. He was promising struggle, a struggle worth enduring. And as night fell once more over the Sahel, a question echoed across the continent, whispered in markets, in homes, in places where hope had long been buried. Is this the moment Africa broke its chains? The West feared the answer. But in Burkina Faso, the people already knew.